Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to another night of studying the book of Acts. Welcome. I'm your host, John Korkadakis, and guess what? We're into the third last week of our study. So I hope you've been learning a lot. I hope you've been challenged. I hope it's been inspirational for you. I hope you're looking at the book of Acts in a new light, and you're just seeing things in a brand new way about how God used this time period to bring the church into the world and the message of Jesus Christ and the gospel. So it's really good to have you here with us. And as I said, we're into chapters 22 and 24. And next week, we've only got two studies left after tonight. And next week we're doing 25 to 28, and we'll close off. But don't miss the last week. In the years that I've teach this, and in fact for many of my classes, especially for the classes where I teach a biblical book, I always end with a class that says, what about this for today? Like, why should we care? Did we just study the book of Acts as a historical thing? Are we just studying the book of Acts for something to recount, the theological doctrines that are important to us, as well and good as they are? But what should it mean for us today? So that's a really important part of it. So don't miss the last class, because the last section is when we say, what are all the things that we've learned about the book of Acts, and how does it impact us today, and what should we take away? And for that last class too, if there's something, I say to all my students, is if there's something that I missed in this list that we're going to go through, let me know. And maybe there's something you're going to take out of this that I don't have as part of that. So anyway, welcome. Nice to have you here. Again, my name's John Korkadakis. I have my website there. If you haven't got the notes for tonight, you can go to my website. Right on the front page, it says, you got the link to the Acts study, and you can download tonight's study, which is, number 9, chapters 22 and 24. And if I haven't mentioned it, or I haven't mentioned it in a while, the study notes stay up there indefinitely. This is the third study that we've done. How to Study the Bible was the first one we did. The seven major Bible chapters that you need to know to understand the incredible story of the Bible. We did that study, and now we're doing the book of Acts. So those studies are there, and you can get on the YouTube channel, and you can watch those at any time. Encourage others to watch. It's just a great opportunity to learn. And again, I'm honored that you're here. And again, I hope that you're really learning something, and it's of value to you. So, last week when we left off, the Apostle Paul, we were into chapter 21, and we ended on chapter 21, and the Apostle Paul had been arrested. So let's get to the notes and talk about this, because as Paul has been arrested, and as they're ready to kind of take him away, he asks to speak to the crowd. So in end of chapter 21, beginning of chapter 22, we have Paul addressing the crowd. And Paul's use of Aramaic is really interesting, because Aramaic is the lingua franca. It is the language of the Palestinian Jews. And Paul is showing his language skills here. So he's speaking to the crowd in Aramaic, which is really important, because he addresses them with respect and warmth. So for the remainder of Acts, there isn't a lot left in chapter form of the book of Acts, Paul's speeches are primarily apologetic and defensive in nature. He's being accused of quite a few things from the Jews. And now Paul is defending the gospel, defending the message of Jesus Christ, and defending himself from apostasy and other things that are being leveled against him. So Paul's main defense is not disloyalty per se, to Israel as a nation, but obedience to a divine imperative. And he kind of recaps his a Damascus Road experience, that he was called divinely by God, by Jesus himself, to do this. And this, and as we've, if you've been part of the study, you know that Luke, writing this, has mentioned Paul's conversion experience a few times now. And it's an important component to the apologetic that Paul uses in speaking to the crowds. Paul begins by relating his life prior to his conversion. He emphasizes his background and his education. He studied under one of the most respected teachers of the day, who is Gamaliel. Now, Gamaliel was the grandson of a famous rabbi called Hillel. And if you look into ancient Jewish, rabbinical documents, Hillel's name is going to come up because he was highly revered and respected as a teacher of the law. And he ruled the council of the Sanhedrin and was lauded for his wisdom and knowledge, and is mentioned in the Talmud, and also by a man by the name of Josephus, which is a historian of the time period that we get a lot of historical data from. So he's even mentioned by Josephus. And Josephus specifically wrote about the noble character of Gamaliel's son Simon. The Mishnah, which is the document that talks about the teachings of the rabbis and their interpretation of the Torah, the law, claims Gamaliel as one of Judaism's greatest teachers. So if you ever picked up a Mishnah, it's a big thick book, and it's we had to go through it in seminary ourselves, and I don't even know where mine is. I wish I could just pull it out, but it's quite a document, and Gamaliel is mentioned in there in his interpretation of certain passages. So he's a well-respected teacher. Now, I've got a note in there from a commentary by Bach. If you're following around in your notes, one of the textbooks I use for this course when I teach it at the college and seminary is by a professor by the name of Bach, and he gives a two-part outline that shows the rhetorical strength of Paul's message to the crowd. Paul gives this biography, which stresses three themes. Paul, and again, if you've been part of this study, you know that Paul is an amazing communicator, not in the sense that he's really flashy or anything like that. He just knows where to connect with people. He knows his audience really well, and he knows how to answer the questions or the accusations that are being leveled against him, or even the things that are happening in people's minds that he knows is part of their questioning whether or not they're going to believe what Paul is saying. So in his commentary, he says Paul's biography stresses these three things. He was born and cultured in Tarsus, and Tarsus is the third most respected community for education and arts, and those Athens was one, Alexandria was the other, and Tarsus was a well-respected place for the higher intellect and people of high culture of that time. So he's born and raised, and he was raised there. And he was instructed, again, by this good Pharisee, who is well respected in that day too, is Gamaliel. But the entire message is based on three arguments. Paul says, I was where you were. I was absolutely where you were. And I was called by God. So I'm not a stranger to the situation that you find yourself in. And I was called by God, and I was called to be a witness to the nations. That's Paul's argument as he's speaking to the crowd. Now, Paul in verses 17 to 21 relates a vision that he received while praying in the temple, where he is instructed by Jesus to leave Jerusalem because the people would not accept his witness. That was part of his testimony. And Paul's mention of his mission to the Gentiles absolutely infuriates the crowd, but also validates the vision he just recounted. Okay, now we have to remember, this is one of those difficult cultural things, but for the early church, the Judaizers really struggled with the message of God, whether it's law or love, going out to the heathen or the pagans or the unwashed or the unclean. That was not something that they took lightly. So the church going to the Gentile people was really quite problematic for people who had grown up that they were the chosen ones, whether rightly or wrongly, the way they understood it. So there's two important things to note. Many commentators believe the anger from the crowd is not so much the mission to the Gentiles per se, but a mission without first introducing them to Judaism and the law. The crowd's reaction denotes frustration and blasphemy. Now, as much as we want to justify that, I think that's part of the reason why Paul, in a number of places, especially in Romans, he says the gospel, the good news of the Lord Jesus Christ, first to the Jew, then to the Gentile, like that progression that he talks about. And in fact, part of Paul's argument is that, wait a minute, you've been presented this message as Jews. You're not getting a different message that the Gentiles are getting. You're getting the same message ultimately. So that's an important thing. Secondly, it calls into question the Jewish understanding of the servant songs in Isaiah, especially chapter 53. If you know anything about chapter 53, if you've been a believer for a long period of time, you know chapter 53 is one of the hallmark chapters in the Old Testament, predicting the suffering servant that really predicted the person of Jesus Christ and what he was going to accomplish on the cross and what that was going to mean for the world, how that was going to impact the entire world, not just the Jewish people. And, how well did they perceive the messianic mission as one that involved the entire world? That was such a stumbling block for the Judaizers at this time. How could, God bring into his kingdom these people who are unclean, unwashed, pagan, all of those categories and things that the Jewish people had at that time? Now, Bach says really something quite profound in his commentary, and I wrote it in the notes here, is the bulk of Jerusalem has reacted now against Jesus, against John the Baptist, against Stephen, and now Paul. For the book of Acts, this is the final key rejection of the gospel. That they have heard this numerous times. This is part of the way that Luke is communicating his writing at this point in time, is that, this has been repeated numbers of times, that they're hearing this message. They're seeing the signs. They're seeing the miracles. They're seeing the healings. They're seeing the teachings. They're seeing the transformation of people. They're seeing the church explode. But there's still this outright rejection that is continuing to be part of, some of the individuals are part of the church. So let's move on to the next part here. Now, at the end of this, they go to flog. They go to lash Paul as part of his being arrested. And so the commander orders Paul to be, lashed and whipped. And many commentators believe that this is the Roman practice of scourging, and Jesus was scourged before he was crucified. And they believe that this pattern is now in process with the Apostle Paul. And Paul claims his Roman citizenship. He just says, wait a minute, are you going to lash at me, since I'm a Roman citizen? And if Paul had been scourged, it would have been his worst beating to date. And he's been beaten quite a few times, so it would have been his worst beating to date. And what I find fascinating, and what a number of commentators see fascinating, is the amount of self-control and calmness that Paul exhibits in this particular passage. It's almost like they've got the whip up and they're just ready, and Paul says, "Oh, wait a minute, I happen to be a Roman citizen. Does that matter at all?" and it could have been a catastrophic. It would have led most likely to him being scourged just short of his life if they didn't take his life at all. But because of this, because he's a Roman citizen, this continues to propel Paul towards Rome. Now remember, back a few chapters, we started seeing that there's this sudden imperative for the Apostle Paul to go to Rome no matter what. And we're seeing the shift happen in the book of Acts now, where the main goal of the Apostle Paul is to make it to Rome. Rome is the place. So this becomes one of the catalysts for Paul getting to Rome. So we've got Paul before the council. Let me get the next up, and of course I get the wrong slide up there, right? I'm so good at this. So Paul is brought before the high council, and this is at least the sixth time that the Sanhedrin have had to evaluate the claims of Christ. The other five are, I've got a chart there. The other five is when they met to evaluate the reports of Jesus's actual trial, the trial of Peter and John early on in Acts, then the trial of the 12 apostles. We have that as well, and then Stephen's trial. So at least this many occasions, and we've talked already a little bit about how many times the message of the gospel has been repeated, especially to the religious leaders and the Sanhedrin. So Paul's opening remarks evokes this violent response from Ananias the high priest, and a typical reaction from Paul. Paul just, obviously reacts. He's just been violated. And Ananias, if you know anything about Ananias, he was a corrupt priest. And he was even assassinated by his own people almost 10 years after Paul stood before him. So he had a long, long history of, all kinds of corruption and political intrigues, and just not a good person. And if you know anything about the Sanhedrin, they were more a political party as opposed to a religious party. They had certain elements of religion tied to it, but as Sanhedrin, they were, very powerful in the sense of political movement. Now, Paul's inability to recognize the high priest has obviously garnered a lot of speculation, because he doesn't realize that the person who just slapped him is the high priest. But the way Luke presents this section, he's presenting it that it was called in haste, and if there's any protocols that should have been part of this mock trial, which we're seeing similar to what Jesus had to experience, it's got all kinds of protocol inconsistencies. So it's not the normal course of how one of these things would have been enacted or conducted by the religious leaders. And it's interesting to note that Paul in verse 6 changes his entire tactic. And again, I love this. You could almost do an entire course on the way that Paul adapts and pivots and understands his audience, and the things we could learn from the Apostle Paul. And he changes his tactics. He realized what's going on. And, the controversy of the resurrection has long been an item of division between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The Sadducees did not believe in a resurrection. And Paul raised the issue, and he purposely does it to divide this council. Now, another thing with the time of the religious leaders, for the Pharisees and the Sadducees to get together, in all honesty, you knew it had to be something that was going to be a common benefit for the two of them, because they didn't typically get together unless they had to. Okay, they had so many things that differentiated them. Now I've got a chart there, by the way, that and again, if you're paying for the course, this chart right here between the Pharisees and Sadducees is worth the price of admission. If I could just say that, myself, because a lot of people hear about the Pharisees and the Sadducees, but they don't technically know what the differences are and what categorizes them as people of these groups. Now, I'm going to go through it really quickly. Thanks for your patience, but got it right here. But the Pharisees likely originated with the Hasidim in the Maccabean period. The Maccabean period happened during the silence between the Old Testament and the New Testament. There was 400 years of silence. There's the Maccabean revolt in the Maccabees, who were a Jewish family that became kind of messianic figures in Jerusalem and in Israel at the time. So they believe that the Pharisees grew out of that. Now, the Sadducees, on the other hand, they were a sect of aristocrats, and they flourished from 200 BC until the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD. What is interesting is that, it's kind of like the next point for the Sadducees, but when the temple and Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD, the Sadducees were no more. No more, because their political power came as political allies of Rome. And when Rome destroyed the temple, the Sadducees, virtually evaporated overnight. Now the Pharisees, their name likely comes from, likely means separated ones in Hebrew. And it's a name that got attached to them when they separated from a Hasmonean ruler, John Hyrcanus, in 135, 104 BC, over a dispute over the priesthood. So they were fighting over priesthood at that time. And the Pharisees were organized in small fellowships, and for the most part stayed away from the ruling powers in Jerusalem. In all honesty, the Pharisees were trying to be, men of God. Okay, I know that for many Christians, evangelicals, and people looking at the stories in the Bible, the Pharisees do not fare well. But the reality is too, many Pharisees did come to faith in Christ, and there were a lot of the religious, Pharisee sects that did become part of the early church. So, and they were conflicted people. Can we just, they grew up with the law, they grew up with the strictures of Judaism, they had all kinds of things that they had to manage. And then all of a sudden, the Jesus movement comes and literally crashes everything that they had grown up and understood. So, and unfortunately, God incarnate standing right in front of them, and many of them missed it, and that was really unfortunate. The Sadducees, on the other hand, they played a leading role in the trial and condemnation of Jesus because of their political allegiance as well. That's an important connector to make. The Pharisees steadily gained authority among the people, primarily through the establishment of synagogues. Synagogues became really important because they became mini community centers in everywhere that they established synagogues. They were really, really important. And according to sources, there were 400 synagogues in the city of Jerusalem alone. Now, I got to tell you, I read that and I go, how's that possible? 400. That's a lot of churches on every corner. And I've been trying to get, I know where I've gotten the statistic from, and it continues to be corroborated, but that's just a lot of synagogues. So you can imagine just how much influence the Pharisees had. The most reliable information on the Sadducees comes from three sources, by the way: Flavius Josephus, the historian that we've mentioned from time to time, the New Testament, and rabbinic compilations. Apart from Josephus in his document called War, most sources are decidedly hostile to this group because of their political allegiances. They're rarely, if ever, and even in War, I think it's tempered somewhat by Josephus, but they're not shown in very favorable light. They were very politically oriented, and anyone that's very politically oriented, well, I'll just leave it at that. That's all I could say. Now, during when the temple was destroyed in 70 A.D., the Pharisees were the driving force behind the Yavna or Yamnia, where Palestinian Judaism survived. They were the ones that started to keep the text of the Old Testament and start the preservation of the text of the Old Testament. And they would debate. The first council debated Ecclesiastes and the Song of Songs. Like, is this part of Scripture? And anyway, that's a whole convoluted sort of story about, how these different Pharisee sects preserved the Old Testament and preserved it for us to have today. There's only the Masoretic text. The Masoretes were a Pharisaic sect that preserved the Old Testament, and they are the ones that finalized the vowel pointing system, because the original Hebrew did not have vowel points. It was all consonants, and it was one continual strand of text in consonants, and it was the Masoretes that came along and added the vowel points and other kind of punctuation marks to the Hebrew text, just so it could be preserved for all time, and people would read it long after people had forgotten Hebrew or had forgotten, because now the people are dispersed, and other languages, Greek has taken over, Latin, Aramaic has taken over. They get dispersed to other parts of the world, and Hebrew really for kind of takes a back seat to other languages. So that's one of the things that was really important. So if you ever open up your Bible and you read that the Old Testament has been translated in English from the Masoretic text, that is the text in the Old Testament that every Bible translation uses. It's the primary text of the Old Testament, and that's from the Masoretes, the Pharisees. As far as the Sadducees, their opposition to Jesus and the early church in the New Testament is presented as monolithic and constant. They don't deviate from wanting to get rid of Jesus. It's not something that you see a little bit of softening of the Sadducees. It's a very monolithic thing for the two of them. Okay, for the two of them, for the group called the Sadducees, and this is likely due to the fact that they would have viewed the way, the Jesus followers, as a destabilizing political force, not and as well as a theological foe, because obviously there were certain things that they didn't like of it. During Herod's reign, the Pharisees, Jewish sources say that there were probably 6,000 Pharisees. So there's 6,000 Pharisees with 400 synagogues. So they are a force to be reckoned with. There's just a lot of them. And I remember being in a seminary, and we were wrestling through if we lived in Jerusalem at that time and we claimed to be followers of God, the group we might most likely would align ourselves with would be the Pharisees. If we wanted to be authentic followers of God, the Pharisees would be the group that we would, consider aligning ourselves with. Between 6 and 66 A.D., they were able to control the high priesthood. The Sadducees were, which was terrible because, again, it became a political thing, not a something faithful to Jewish history and theological moorings at all. Now, something about the Pharisees that many believers don't realize is that the Pharisees honored oral tradition and gave it equal authority over the written text, even though the written text was so important. But what many believers don't understand is that for the Pharisees, for the Jewish people, they say that when Moses came down the mountain with the 10 Commandments, the tablets, he also came down with all these oral traditions that never got written down, but got communicated generation after generation after generation. And that's part of the oral tradition. Again, a Sermon on the Mount, you've heard Jesus say, you've heard it said, but I say to you. Jesus is actually, not just speaking to the written tradition, but you've heard this explicated by the Pharisees in their sermonettes in the synagogue, and you've heard them expound on the oral tradition and add to the law the more stipulations, because they believe that along with the written text, God deposited to the Jewish people an oral communication. And again, that's a course in and of itself to try to understand the whole concept of the oral tradition and just how much it's impacted Jewish understanding. For the Sadducees, they considered the written text, primarily the Pentateuch, to be written, to be from God. So they didn't give the same credence to the rest of the Old Testament. The Pentateuch was the central document for them. As far as the Pharisees, they believed in the resurrection of the dead, but it's not clear whether it included the flesh or not, or if it was just a spiritual resurrection in that kind of thing. I'm not sure. That's a great question. I'm not sure that the oral tradition is the same. I think for certain sects of Judaism, there would probably be oral tradition. And part of the oral tradition, somebody's asked the question if that would be still true today. My understanding in some circles, it still is, especially when it comes to tradition, like the Passover meal and some of the blessings that have continued, that there is this understanding that there's an oral tradition that has been passed on as much as the written text. That's my understanding. That's a great question. Thanks very much. But for the Sadducees, they did not believe in a resurrection at all. Immortality of the soul. They didn't believe in angels. They didn't believe in demons or a spiritual world for that matter. They practically denied God's involvement in everyday life. They practically did. So their kind of like religious understanding was very, very narrow and very myopic. Very myopic. The last one, the Pharisees, though they held a minority number of seats on the council, they held great power due to their respect and power given to them by the people. So they did, that's the other thing too, the Pharisees had for the most part, a lot of respect from the people. And, that's something that's an equation that we don't often add in when we see the New Testament, because in many ways the New Testament just they're the enemies, they're the ones, and in many ways they are, because they miss Jesus many times just in front of them, and it was such a difficult thing to communicate to them the heart of what Jesus was doing, because because of the long-standing traditions that the Pharisees had. The revolt of 66 and 70 for the Sadducees spelled the end of that group. As I said earlier, the Romans had no use for a failed aristocracy. So they faded into oblivion. These were a failed aristocracy, so had no use for these particular people. Now that's a short kind of history of those two groups, but it is really important, especially reading the Gospels, to be able to discern something about these groups. Now, going back to the Apostle Paul, this ensuing uproar causes the commander to forcefully rescue Paul because people want to kill him. So Paul may likely have wondered how he would get out of this present mess, but the Lord appears to him again and confirms that he will be a witness in Rome like he has been in Jerusalem. And Paul is getting, these messages from God that, this is your mission. Nothing's going to stop it. And that bolsters Paul's confidence in, what he's sensing from the Spirit of God, etc., etc., etc. Okay, let's move to the next slide. Where are we here? Oh no, that's not the one. Where are we? Paul claims his Roman rights. No, let's go a little further. Okay. I think I've gone too far again. Okay. The plot to kill Paul and his being sent to Caesarea. So the plot is the most detailed against Paul and Acts. This is really amazing, by the way. If those of you that have read these sections as you prepared for this study, there's a real concerted effort by this group to kill Paul. Over 40 had vowed not to eat or drink until Paul is dead. That's 40 people in planning, and they had no trouble enlisting the conspiracy and participation of the High Council. They want him gone as well. This is and what's really cool. This is the only reference in the New Testament to Paul's immediate family. Paul's nephew somehow hears of the plan and relates the details to the commander. So Paul's got a nephew, which is really cool. You don't hear of these apostles and their families and that, but here Paul's nephew hears of this conspiracy and tells the commander and warns him. And from the fortress of Antonia to the hall of the Sanhedrin is quite far apart if you look at it, the Jerusalem and just where these places were at the time. And so it would have given these conspirators ample time to devise a plan to stop whoever it was that was taking Paul to to the hall of Sanhedrin and the prison of Antonia fortress. And it would have been very, very easy. So the commander recognizes the Jews will stop at nothing to get Paul dead. And he orders this heavy guard under the cover of night. This is the third time Paul has to leave the city secretly at night. And the commander, Claudius Lysias, would not want to answer for the death of a Roman citizen due to Jewish fanaticism. So that's something that this commander doesn't want to have to face. So he makes sure that Paul gets out and is free. So he decides to send Paul to Felix, who Felix is the governor at this time. He's the procurator. Wow, I'm having trouble with that word tonight. Governor of Judea. He was responsible for the military and civil affairs, and he was absolutely corrupt. Absolutely corrupt. He was eventually recalled back to Rome by Nero himself. And Pontius Pilate held this office from 26 to 36 AD. And the Roman historian Tacitus is another really cool Roman historian. We talked about Josephus. Tacitus is another one. And he described Felix like this. This is a brutal statement. Antonius Felix practiced every kind of cruelty and lust, wielding the power of a king with all the instincts of a slave. From Tacitus. That's quite a cruel comment about this particular person. And this is who Paul is being sent to. So the commander's, writes a letter, paints him in the best possible light, and at the same time giving due respect to Felix. And Felix agrees to hear Paul's case and is kept until all his accusers arrive from Jerusalem. And that's where they're waiting for. Okay, let me get the next slide up here. Now I've got a chart there because at this point there's a lot of commonalities between Peter and Paul. Now in the early part, second half of the book, we're talking about Peter being the primary person that is focused on in the book of Acts. Latter part of the book, it's the Apostle Paul. But this chart shows all the similarities that the two of them had through the book of Acts. That, God was using both of these men mightily. So I've got that chart for you. It's something that you could look at on your spare time. I hope it blesses you. But I hope it teaches you that there's this incredibly sovereign and providential work of God, happening in both of these men's lives that are primary instruments that God uses to birth the church and to see it explode in the world at that time. So that's another chart that's really helpful for you that you can keep for a later time. So let me move on here. We're getting close to our time. So Paul appears before Felix, and the hatred of Paul is evidenced by the speed in which the entourage from Jerusalem arrives. The 5 days and 65-mile journey, accompanied by the high priest himself, denotes the seriousness of the matter. This wasn't something that the high priest would show up here. And they brought a lawyer with them, and the Greek word is rhetoros, where we get rhetoric from. And he's a person skilled in argumentation and oratory speech, which is an important skill set in the ancient world. That was you got paid big dollars if you could communicate really well and convince people and use the skill of oratory. And again, that's a whole nother historical lesson about the ancient world at that time. Tertullus is, praise of Felix. This is the lawyer, the Tertullus. Praise of Felix is typical of the time, but it also serves as a prelude to the three basic charges that this lawyer presents against Paul. The first one is the personal charge of heresy. I think I'm in the wrong. Am I in the wrong? Yeah, I might have missed. Okay, there it is. So there's a personal charge of heresy that, it calls it the cult of the Nazarene, strangely enough. Secondly, there's a political charge of treason. This guy's a troublemaker. He's stirring up all kinds of riots. Everywhere he goes, people are after him. He's just stirring up trouble. And there's a religious charge of sacrilege. He desecrated the temple. So those are three very, very serious charges. And all the Jews, confirm the charges, and there's an implication that they expect Felix to kind of dispatch the thing, quickly, because who wouldn't charge this Paul guy against, all these charges, which are incredibly serious. So, as they're sitting kind of back, the text kind of implies, get out of this one now before Felix. And Felix has this reputation of, dealing with these things, expediting these things really quickly. But here again, Paul proves himself. This guy is not someone to take for granted at all. Paul presents these rational counter arguments and methodically refutes each one of the lawyer's assertions. In response to the first charge, Paul says, I've only been in Jerusalem 12 days. I didn't even have enough time to create the kind of trouble that I'm being accused of. I couldn't have done that in the short amount of time I was in Jerusalem. And secondly, the charge of leading a cult, he shows that the teachings are in absolute harmony with the Hebrew Scriptures. I'm not teaching anything different. I'm teaching from the very scriptures that these people claim to honor. And the third thing is, Paul responds that he came to Jerusalem to worship and to bring financial aid. What's very interesting, and we have nowhere in the book of Acts where Paul's going to all these different places and he's coming back to Jerusalem. And one of the primary reasons he's coming back to Jerusalem is because he's collected money from the various churches and is coming to give the money. But here he admits it. He talks about that, even though that wasn't a primary thing in the earlier chapters, the chapters before this, about Paul's coming to Jerusalem. We find that out in 1st and 2nd Corinthians and other passages like that that's the reason why Paul was coming in the first place. So from there, let me get to this. I'm really having trouble tonight, ain't I? So as Paul appears before Felix, again, Paul once again repeats the statement that he holds a clear conscience before God. This is the same phrase that Paul used before the high council in chapter 23 that provoked the high priest to slap him. And Paul repeats it again, because conscience is a really, it's where you hold the capacity to feel guilt. And Paul is stating very clearly, there's nothing for me to be guilty of. Okay? I hold this in good conscience, what I am doing. So Paul notes that his original accusers aren't even present. The original ones that made the original accusation, they're not even present. A detail that Longnecker in his commentary, this is another professor in his commentary, gives clarity to. Okay, Paul is appealing to Roman law, legitimate Roman law at the time, because Roman law imposed heavy penalties if you accuse somebody and then you abandon the charges, and the disappearance of the accusers often meant the withdrawal of the charge. So their absence, therefore, suggested that they had nothing against Paul that would stand up in a Roman court. Okay, so Paul knows his law. Paul knows what it means to be a citizen. Paul knows his rights. But not only that, he knows all the theological arguments and the cultural, social arguments, and he's defending himself. Paul further argues that even the Sanhedrin could not testify to his guilt. The raising again of Paul's belief in the resurrection stresses to Felix that this is a theological debate. This is this is a matter that any good smart Roman official is going to want to avoid. The wise Roman official is not going to want to mediate a theological debate among Jewish people. So Felix postpones any future decision until Lysias arrives, who's the commander that's sent there. An apparent delay tactic, considering that the commander's letter was already in Felix's hand. And Paul, though he was still under arrest, is given considerable freedom during his arrest. Now, Felix is along with his wife Drusilla in the text, and they're both intrigued theologically by what is happening. So let me get the next slide up here before. Boy, I'm really not doing all that well today, am I? Okay. Yeah, I'm really not doing very well. Yeah. So he's got the letter in his hand, and I think I missed out. All right. But an interesting note about Drusilla and kind of like the intrigue of the families of Felix and all of those. Drusilla was the youngest daughter of Herod Agrippa I, and he ruled in Palestine from 37 to 44 AD. He authorized the death of James, son of Zebedee, and imprisoned Peter. Drusilla was Felix's third wife, whom he married when she was just 16, and she is now 19. She had been married to Azizus, king of Emesa, which was a state in Syria, so she's been married before. And Felix has been married twice before. The first being the granddaughter, by the way, of Antony and Cleopatra. So we've got, the intrigue of, the whole Antony, Cleopatra, Roman, emperors, etc., etc. Drusilla, interestingly enough, this woman here, interestingly enough, died along with the child that she had by Felix when Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 AD. So that's how she met her end, Drusilla. Just an interesting kind of historical, tidbit here. So that's kind of like the background of Felix and the kind of intrigues, family, and the different marriages and all the things that were happening in this particular family. Now, Paul ends up, being a prisoner of Felix. Now, he's got a certain element of freedom at this particular time. But this cycle lasts for 2 years. Imagine that. Like, scripturally, we read it, and it's just like, okay, the next event, the next event, the next event, that kind of, But the reality is this kind of pause that we have, sort of like in the text, is a kind of a 2-year pause. And it's not, Felix ends up becoming replaced by Festus. And Festus served as the governor of Judea from 59 to 61 AD. So, Felix isn't dealing with this particular problem. He doesn't want to, get in the middle of it. So it kind of holds Paul in limbo until, the next governor comes along and just kind of passes it off to him. And many commentators, believe that Luke may have written his gospel during this particular time. That, and not only that, but even part of Acts. Many commentators, many scholars believe that this 2-year time period is a time period where, not only Luke got to write, but even the Apostle Paul. And some, many, I don't know how many, I can say from a percentage standpoint, but there's much speculation that Paul probably wrote, part or all of the prison epistles, and during this particular time. Now, the prison epistles are, Philippians, Ephesians, Colossians, and Philemon. That those 4 documents, or parts of them, could have been written during this time, Roman prison. He had the freedom to write, but he didn't have the freedom to go wherever he wanted. So that's what sort of brings all of this to the kind of point that we're at. I have a quote at the very end of this from Alistair McGrath, who wrote about Luther and describes Martin Luther's conviction that God promises to be present with us, even in life's darkest hours. And if experience cannot detect him as being present, then that verdict of experience must be considered unreliable. Now, the reason I put that in there, the point of the notes, is that, throughout Paul's ordeal, he knows and he's experiencing the presence of God in the worst circumstances of his life. And not only sensing the presence of God and sensing the work of the Spirit of God in his life, but even to the understanding of the mission and the purpose that Paul has been given by the Lord. And it's striking that that's kind of, I think it's Andy Stanley who asked the question in one of his sermons a number of years ago, how different would your life be if you knew that God was absolutely with you? That no matter what you did, you knew that God was absolutely with you. I think that's a powerful question. And for the Apostle Paul, in the difficulties and everything that he's experienced. And here he is in a 2-year holding pattern, that he knew that the presence of God, that God was with him in all of it. So that wraps up our study for tonight. We're actually a couple minutes early. Thank you everyone for tolerating my trying to figure out what slide I was on and all of that. But we're coming to the end of this. As I said, we have 2 more studies to do, and that's the end of the book of Acts. Again, if you liked what you have, what you witnessed and enjoyed and were inspired tonight, hit the like button. I would really like that. If you haven't been part of this study before, or hit the subscribe button, that would be really great. And again, you can get all the notes if you've only jumping in at a certain part of the study. You can go back to my website, download all the notes. They're free for you to take, and you can listen to any of the other lectures at another time. But I hope you've been blessed tonight. It's really great to have a number of you here and enjoy this particular study. And I hope you're learning something about the book of Acts that's really meaningful for you today. And again, don't miss the last one, because we're going to have a great conversation about what all of this means and what we can take away from the book of Acts and how it should impact us. Because, as I said before, when I teach, I say, why should anybody care about this? Why is this such an important thing to infuse our lives with? So